Hi, my name's Wayne Bergeron, and I'm an associate professor here at the University of North Alabama, and I teach criminal justice and security and emergency management. So I want to welcome you to this video series, so you know, discussing issues surrounding coronavirus and COVID-19. So today I want to talk about this idea of flattening the curve. You may have heard about this in the media or in articles you may have seen in reference to the outbreak. So what do we mean when we talk about flattening the curve? So as you can see, when we talk about flattening the curve, what we're discussing here is the progression of disease infections over time. And with no protective measures, what we find is that the daily number of cases quickly begins to escalate and begins to accelerate exponentially until it reaches sort of a critical point or a critical mass or the peak, as you can see here. As we know, the problem with this is that our health system capacity is very limited. We only have a certain amount of health capacity. And so when our number of cases quickly exceeds the health capacity, i.e. people who need to get treated, then our system is quickly overloaded. Most hospitals only have a certain amount of surge capacity, and so when you have people that need medical care, in addition to all the normal type medical care like heart attacks and wrecks and people having babies, the system is quickly overloaded. So when we talk about flattening the curve, what we're trying to do is spread those cases out over time, using protective measures to reduce both the speed at which people contract the infection and also the overall total number of people who contract the infection as well. This buys time for the healthcare system to, number one, deal with the patients, and number two, add capacity if needed. As we see in this slide, why is it important that we act early with COVID-19? Well, we know that if this large peak with no protective measures gives us that big spike and our system's overloaded. What we want to do is we want to have delay. We want to have protective action, which then shows us that the green area, those will be the patients that we can well treat and we can keep the capacity of the system better in line with the number of the cases. In those cases, we have a lower mortality. So as we look at this, we know from history that this plays out. If we look at three cities, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Denver during the Spanish flu of 1918, as we see in Philadelphia, they didn't apply protective measures early enough, and they got the large peak. Their system was overloaded, and obviously casualties were much higher. St. Louis, on the other hand, began aggressive measures fairly early on. Although they still had cases, what they find is that the cases were more spread out, less fatalities over time. Denver, on the other hand, implemented measures, but they didn't sustain them long enough. And so they had actually two peaks, which obviously increased their case rate over time. So if we look at this, we've seen this same thing play out in China with coronavirus, where if you look at this, we have the top part of the slide where we have transmission rate that basically stays the same. We don't have those protective measures, and even with travel reduction, we have that big bulge. This is shown in the size of the circles versus a curve in this case. If we could reduce our transmission rate by 25% with social distancing, isolation, and other measures, what we see is that travel reductions and travel restrictions actually begin to pay off because we spread out the number of cases and the circles are smaller. Still have cases, but they're smaller circles, a smaller bulge, if you will, in the curve. If we can get our transmission rate down by 50%, roughly cut it in half, we find that travel reductions and travel restrictions actually keep the case rate steady over time. So we don't really have a bulge at all. We're still treating cases. But the medical system can basically handle it. This chart kind of shows us similar outcomes. And in this case, we want to look at Singapore and Japan in particular. If you look at Iran, Italy, and South Korea, they had that large spike in cases and that exponential growth in the steep curve. With Japan and Singapore, they implemented measures early on, restrictive measures, fairly aggressive. In the case of Singapore, you can see their line is almost flatline. They had cases, but they were spread out over time, and the system was able to handle it. Japan had a larger number of cases, but again, over time, they were spread out, and you didn't have this large exponential growth. In the U.S., we're on the beginning of this curve. We're not really sure whether ours is going to end up more like Iran or Italy or South Korea, or whether it's going to end up more like Japan or Singapore. The measures we're implementing now in the United States are going to determine over time from first case outward what that's going to look like. So we know by looking at this model that the daily new cases are going to be impacted by social distancing. Even measures taken one day apart, you can see the outcome here. With no social distancing, we're going to see that steep climb. With social distancing, we're going to begin to see the cases drop off fairly quickly. But even one day, as we see here, of delaying and implementing these measures is going to have an impact. The outcomes are going to get worse. So what does this mean for the United States? Well, we're going to get through this. At the state, the local, and even at the federal level, we're beginning to implement measures like social distancing, like travel restrictions, like isolation, like quarantine, and we're ramping up testing. That's going to give us the knowledge that we need for this outcome, and we hopefully should be able to begin to see the cases spread out. We'll be able to flatten the curve, and we'll be able to deal with the situation. So keep calm and wash your hands.